Hopefully I won't get the wrap-up music, but I love the fact that there is some. So my slides will overlap a little bit. If you were here for Patrick and Dinesh this morning, he wanted me to cover a little bit of insights around the region, so I'll try and do that. A little bit about us is, Jungle's Series A, Series B fund. We've also spun off a seed fund, as well as a healthcare fund, all based in Singapore. And I've been covering the region from a tech perspective for coming up on 20 years. The thing I love about this space so much is it's constantly evolving. But I think if you think about what's going on today in the world, the global tectonic plates, I think, are shifting. And it's been interesting to watch, and I think it'll continue to be interesting to watch. Some of the things that we're tracking, if you think about Silicon Valley, I don't know how much you look at deal flow there, but for seed rounds in Silicon Valley, they're down 60%. So the number of seed investors are down almost 40%. And the problem that starts to create is that it creates a funnel problem. So the less seed capital that's going out and companies that are getting funded, fewer companies become Series A, fewer companies become Series B. And so as US venture capital funds continue to raise larger and larger funds and have to increase their minimum capital deployment, so they're investing larger amounts of money, they're moving later stage, and so the earlier stage is not developing enough in the US. And then even in the later stage, some of the performance, if you think about Domo, is not actually delivering results. And then compound that with Peter Thiel and others, now abandoning Silicon Valley, one from a cost perspective, but I think also from just a general mindset perspective. And then on the other side, if you think about what's happening in China today, so Forbes puts out a Midas list, first time Neil Shen, Chinese VC, #1 on the list, which has been super interesting. China is now basically equivalent in 2017 with the amount of venture funding, both at about $71 billion roughly. But the interesting thing is Asia, and that includes here as well as China, is doubling every year, while the US venture capital investing is only growing at about 17%. So as a result, 3 out of the top 5 unicorns, 5 out of the top 10 Chinese companies, and then China is putting a lot more into developing its ecosystem, whether it's R&D spend, whether it's investing. One of the things that I think we're seeing quite a bit here is the appetite for Chinese tech companies to make investments, to build up minority portfolios, to dip their toes into new waters, to move into adjacencies. And that's just something that traditional US internet companies, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Yahoo, just hasn't done. I think Google's probably been the leader in that space in how they've been investing at either at the venture stage or at the growth stage. But most US tech companies really aren't building up minority portfolios, which I think will become a disadvantage. So when I spoke here last year, this is how I ended. This was the last slide. And I think it's actually even more true today. And so I brought it up to the front of the deck because I think this is becoming a bigger and bigger opportunity. And the reason I say that is this part of the world has the highest growth, so the highest GDP growth. So our neighbor, and actually everyone's taking photos. I think all the slides are available at the end, so if you want a copy, but feel free to take photos too. But India, we look at India a lot because it's just from a proximity perspective, and this region's growing at 1.4 times what India is on a GDP per capita basis. And we also have an enormous population. So Dinesh showed this slide this morning. US population, the whole population is about 323 million. Online is about 280. We now have more internet users in this part of the world at the end of last year, so this is a 2017 number, than the entire population of the US. And if you believe the Google Temasek report, which came out in 2017, we're adding about 3 million new internet users every month. So we should be getting closer to 400 million at the end of this year and continuing to grow from there. So finally, this region has an enormous population, an enormous addressable market size that startups can start to go after. And the interesting thing with that population is that if you take the major metros, so a lot of tech businesses are not necessarily national businesses. A lot are major metro-focused businesses. So, you could have a business and you say, well, we're in Indonesia, but the reality is you're in Jakarta. Or if you're in Thailand, but the reality is you're in Bangkok. And the reason why the major metros are so interesting is the GDP per capita. So as you have urbanization, you have more wealth getting created, you have a larger population, logistics is easier. There's just a lot of consumption that's going to happen in major metros. And so if you think about this from an expansion perspective, so if you're a Chinese internet business, you've carved out a pretty good position in China, and you're now starting to think about geographic expansion. And you're saying, do I expand into a tier 2 or a tier 3 city in China? Or if you're an Indian company, do you expand into a tier 2 city in India? Or do you potentially look at Southeast Asia, where you have very high GDP per capitas, you have large addressable market sizes. And so I think more and more you'll start to see these companies start to look at Southeast Asia, major metros, as a point of expansion rather than expanding within their own domestic markets. I also think it's an interesting market in which to build an international playbook. And so if you're an internet company in India or China or the US and you're thinking about expanding, this is a good test market to come first, to build that international playbook and then think about broader expansion. So I think we'll see that increase more and more. And that's driving a lot of the consumption. So you have a very young population, they're urbanized, increasing GDP per capita. This is the slide from the Google Temasek report. We actually have been talking to both Google and Temasek about revising this. This came out now over 2 years ago. I think what this would, if you actually revise this, I think what we would see is it's actually, progressing at a much faster rate than what they were anticipating. Social media, so we just had Facebook up on stage. I think one of the things that we're seeing is that Southeast Asia has traditionally been quite difficult because of the fragmentation that the market has. Every country, different language, different currency, different regulatory environment. But the thing that's actually we're seeing is that there's a homogeneous amount of consumption and consumerism. So if you think about a 22-year-old woman in Bangkok versus a 22-year-old in Jakarta or Singapore or KL, how they're using their phone, how they communicate with their friends, the brands that they aspire to, because of social media, are becoming much, much more similar. The actual app that they use to communicate, that may be different, but how they're doing it there's a lot more homogeneous behavior that's happening. And so as a result, you can see companies expand much more rapidly around the region. The other interesting thing is in the SME space. So if you think about Singapore as an example, in Singapore, 99% of all businesses in Singapore are SMEs. 2/3 of the workforce in Singapore work for SMEs, and 50%, half of GDP, is generated by SMEs. Now, historically, SMEs in this part of the world, like many others, in low wage environments, would throw people at problems. So if you had a company that had a warehouse and there was issues in the warehouse, you would hire some people, put them in the warehouse, and they would solve the issues. But as wages are increasing, and as the second generation of a lot of these founders are starting to come into the business, they say, well, actually, if I bought a warehouse management system, or if I adopted software, I could actually reduce headcount. I could actually save costs. I could actually become more efficient. And so you're seeing lots and lots of SMEs start to adopt technology, start to adopt software and implement that into their businesses. And I think that's creating an enormous amount of opportunity for startups in this part of the world. We've invested in a company called Descara, which competes with Xero and NetSuite. Started out with an ERP, CRM, accounting package. They now have over 15,000 SMEs using it across Southeast Asia and India. It's integrated into all the local languages. It understands filing requirements, whether in Thailand or whether in Singapore. Very, very local. And so there's more and more opportunities coming up for businesses in the SME space, and there's over 100 million SMEs just in Southeast Asia. We're also seeing a lot more innovation that's happening. And so, on the next, another slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about white space. But, for a long time, people said that, all the innovation was happening in Silicon Valley or China. And I actually think that's being disproven now. There's a lot more innovation that's happening in this part of the world. There's a lot more talent that's coming in. I think talent is still an issue. But a lot of that innovation is driving venture funding. And so if you think about emerging markets, the various emerging markets around the world, South Asia, which is basically ASEAN, Southeast Asia, is now the largest pool of capital for venture across all of the emerging markets. So he had over almost 50 billion was raised, 600 venture capital funds, and South Asia is almost 15 billion of that. Singapore is about 60%. So just under $9 billion of capital has been raised for VCs since 2008. And so that's been a sea change in terms of the amount that's been able to go out and to build startups, the ecosystem. Obviously, a lot of people talk about the size of venture capital. The reality is that if you break it up by mega rounds versus what everybody else gets, it's actually a pretty stark contrast. And so 85% of total capital has gone into a handful of companies. And so if you actually strip that out, it's actually been pretty nice growth since 2013. So more and more capital has become available to startups as they continue to grow. And if you think about the stage of round, so even a couple of quarters ago in Q1 of 2017, it was almost 90% was going into seed or Series A. And then as those companies move through and that cohort is now raising Series Bs or raising Series Cs and moving on, you see the percentages start to shift. And so this is a trend that you see with a very healthy ecosystem. I think there's more that could be done in the Series B space, but it's been great to see how this has been evolving. And obviously there's liquidity. So James was up here with the ASX. We're seeing that as a path to liquidity in addition to some of the M&A that's been happening. So this has been another interesting trend that I think will only increase over time. And I agree with Patrick's kind of prediction that you'll see more IPOs start to happen. And then I still think there's an enormous amount of white space. So there's certain categories in Southeast Asia where there's just no real competitors today. There's some real battlegrounds. So tomorrow, Amit from Red Doors is presenting. He was in a very tough fight for a number of years with a few competitors and really has now emerged as a market leader. There's other battles going on. The car classified space, I think, is a great one where there's just a lot of companies, all venture-backed, all competing for market share. But from a capital perspective, there's less capital going into some of these sectors, and there's some sectors where there's just no real players. And I think that just creates an enormous amount of opportunity. And so time's up. So before the music comes on, just last 3 slides. So number of unicorns starting to slow globally. Dinesh had this slide this morning. In the US, it's been about 3 years on average for these companies to scale to $1 billion. In this part of the world, it's our number that we have, it depends which companies you look at, is just over 5 years. I also think this is compressing. I think companies are getting bigger, faster. The audience size is driving a lot of that. Access to capital is driving a lot of that. And I think this market has an enormous of opportunities. It has all of the ingredients that you need to build very large, global, if you're in the right space, but certainly regional category leaders. So thanks very much.